Washington, D.C., a city where power is contested as fiercely as it is wielded, where narratives are shaped not by truth alone but by those who control the microphone. Here, in the heart of American politics, a single word can spark a firestorm, a single press briefing can shift the national conversation, and a single figure can command the room with unwavering authority. That figure is Karoline Leavitt. At just 28 years old, she has shattered expectations, becoming the youngest White House press secretary in American history. But age is irrelevant in the face of skill, and Leavitt has proven herself more than capable of standing toe-to-toe with the nation's most seasoned journalists. Where others flinch, she pushes forward. Where others deflect, she takes control. With sharp intellect and unrelenting confidence, she has transformed the White House press briefing from a mere exchange of information into a battlefield of ideas, one where she refuses to cede ground. But not everyone in the press corps is willing to concede that battle so easily. Among her most vocal adversaries stand two seasoned journalists, each with a reputation for holding this administration's feet to the fire. Jonathan Rhee of The Washington Post, a relentless critic of the Trump administration, known for dissecting every word, every statement, every perceived misstep with surgical precision. His columns leave little room for nuance. To him, every controversy is a crisis, and every misstep is an indictment. Emily Carter of CNN, a veteran in political reporting whose focus on foreign policy and immigration has made her one of the administration's fiercest opponents. Armed with statistics and moral arguments, she challenges not just policy but the very principles behind it, portraying this White House as indifferent, even callous, to the plight of those affected by its decisions. Today, these two journalists are not just here to ask questions. They are here to confront, to challenge, to expose what they see as the administration's greatest weaknesses. And yet, Karoline Leavitt is not one to be caught off guard. As she steps to the podium, she is met with the usual glare of cameras, the hushed murmurs of reporters flipping through their notes, the thinly veiled anticipation of a press corps eager to set the agenda. But Leavitt knows better. This is not their narrative to control. This is her battlefield, and today, she is ready for war. A brief hush settles over the room, the weight of the moment stretching taut between Karoline Leavitt and the press corps before her. Then, Jonathan Rhee leans forward, seizing the pause as his opening. His voice carries the measured cadence of a journalist who knows exactly how to frame a narrative, not merely as a question but as an assertion masked in inquiry. "Ms. Leavitt," he begins, his tone carefully poised between skepticism and feigned neutrality, "we've heard the president's defenders claim that his words reflect authenticity, a plain-spoken style that resonates with everyday Americans. But let's be honest, this isn't the first time he's made an off-the-cuff remark that shifts focus away from a serious issue. The Black Hawk tragedy deserves careful reflection, yet here we are, talking about a single word instead of the lives lost. Isn't that, at best, a distraction, or at worst, a deliberate tactic?" He lets the question linger, giving the room a chance to absorb its implications, a calculated move, framing the president's words not just as careless but as an intentional ploy. The murmurs of agreement from a few corners of the press gallery suggest it's a theory some are eager to amplify. Karoline doesn't flinch. She doesn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she lets it stretch just long enough to remind the room that she controls the tempo of this exchange, not them. Then, with the practiced ease of someone who has mastered the art of political combat, she leans slightly forward, her voice composed but resolute. "Let's not pretend we don't understand what's happening here," she says, scanning the room with deliberate precision. This briefing began with a moment of silence honoring the lives lost in a tragic military accident. The president stood here, offering words of unity, resilience, and faith, because that's what leaders do in times of grief. A pause, just enough for the weight of her words to settle. And yet, within minutes, the media decided that none of that mattered. Not the victims. Not the families. Not the investigation. Her gaze flicks back to Rhee. "No, what mattered to you was a single word, one moment of human frustration. And now, rather than discuss the cause of this crash or the ongoing efforts to support the families, we're standing here debating tone." She lets the silence stretch again, this time on her terms. So forgive me if I don't entertain the fiction that this is about holding power accountable. Because if it were, the focus of this conversation would be where it belongs, on the facts, on the investigation, on the truth. A flicker of irritation flashes across Rhee's expression. A response is forming on his lips, but before he can cut in, Emily Carter takes the baton, her voice laced with pointed skepticism. "Miss Leavitt," she interjects smoothly, flipping through her notes, "you say this isn't about deflection, but isn't that exactly what's happening here? Shifting blame onto the media rather than acknowledging the reality? The president's words, whether you consider them significant or not, have become the story. That's not our doing, that's his. And let's be frank, this administration has a habit of playing the victim when it faces criticism. So I ask you, is this just another case of the press is the problem, rather than the president taking responsibility for his own rhetoric? There it is, the familiar charge, an attempt to paint the administration as perpetually aggrieved, deflecting scrutiny by turning it back onto the press. It's a tactic Karoline has seen countless times before. She exhales, not out of frustration but out of calculation. Then, with practiced precision, she delivers her counterstrike. "You want to talk about victimhood, Miss Carter? Fine. But let's be clear, the victims here are not this administration. They're not the press corps sitting comfortably in this room. They are the families grieving the loss of their loved ones. And yet, you've chosen to make this about a narrative rather than about them." A murmur ripples through the crowd. Carter's expression remains neutral, but a flicker of tension tightens her posture. "If you want accountability," Karoline presses on, her voice unwavering, "then let's start with the accountability of the media. Because for all the righteous indignation about the president's tone, I have yet to see the same level of scrutiny applied to the inaccuracies, the omissions, the deliberate framing designed not to inform but to inflame." She leans back slightly, letting the tension in the room build. "So no, this administration isn't playing the victim. But we will hold this press corps accountable for how it chooses to cover this administration. If that makes them uncomfortable, so be it." For a moment, the room stills, a brief, charged pause in which the weight of her words settles over the assembled reporters. Then, Rhee shifts in his seat, eyes narrowing as he prepares to launch his next attack. But Karoline is already ahead of him. "Next question." The shift in the room is palpable, the scent of an opening. Emily Carter is the first to seize it. "Miss Leavitt," she says, her voice smooth but edged with an unmistakable bite, "this administration continues to defend its deportation policies as a matter of law and order. But let's talk about what that really means." She glances down at her notes. Though the motion is purely performative, her words are already locked and loaded. Since the start of this year, deportations have surged by nearly 30%. We've seen heartbreaking footage of families separated, of individuals with no violent history being forcibly removed. Critics say these aren't hardened criminals being expelled, they're people trying to build a better life. Mothers, workers, even children. A slight pause, just long enough to let the imagery sink in, before she delivers the real hit. "So I ask you, Miss Leavitt, is this really about enforcing the law, or is it about rallying a base, appeasing hardline voters who want a spectacle rather than a solution?" The question lands like a challenge, a thinly veiled accusation dressed up as concern. The room tenses, the weight of it pressing in. But Karoline doesn't blink. She exhales quietly, as if considering the sheer predictability of the attack. Then, with a measured tilt of her head, she meets Carter's gaze directly. "Let's not conflate emotion with reality, Miss Carter," she begins, her voice calm, precise. "Because if we're going to have this conversation, let's make sure we're having it with the facts in front of us, not just with sound bites designed to stir outrage." She leans slightly forward, her presence grounding the room. "You say deportations have increased by 30%. That's correct. But here's what you left out. 97% of those removed had already been issued deportation orders under the previous administration, orders that were ignored, allowing individuals with no legal right to remain in this country to stay indefinitely. This administration is simply enforcing the laws as written. Nothing more, nothing less." A murmur ripples through the room. Some reporters glance at one another, debating whether to interject. But Karoline isn't finished. "And let's talk about who is actually being deported," she continues, her voice steady. "Because contrary to the narrative being spun here, these are not innocent bystanders swept up in some draconian purge. 83% of those removed had committed felonies or serious offenses, including drug trafficking, fraud, and yes, violent crimes." A flicker of frustration crosses Carter's face, but she doesn't relent. "That still doesn't address the human cost," she presses. "Do you deny that this administration's approach has led to families being separated?" Karoline's expression doesn't change, but there's a shift, a subtle hardening of her gaze. "Families are separated every day when someone breaks the law," she says evenly. "A father who robs a store and is sent to prison. A mother who commits fraud and is sentenced. The law applies to everyone. And yet, only in this case does the press suddenly find it convenient to frame law enforcement as cruel." Carter opens her mouth to push back, but Karoline cuts her off. "You ask whether this is about politics," she continues, as if following the law is somehow a radical concept. "So let's get to the heart of it. If enforcing immigration laws is now controversial, then what exactly do you propose? That we ignore them? That we pick and choose which laws to follow based on political convenience?" A heavy silence settles over the room. "Because if that's the case," she presses, her voice unwavering, "then maybe the real question isn't whether this administration is too strict. Maybe it's whether the last one was simply too weak to do its job." The words land like a hammer, shifting the weight of the room entirely. Carter stiffens slightly, her posture straighter, her lips pressing into a thin line. A beat of silence, not the kind that signals retreat, but the kind that precedes an ambush. Jonathan leans forward again, this time with a sharper edge. "Miss Leavitt," he begins, his tone carefully measured but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of skepticism. "Since we're on the topic of accountability, let's talk about the president's recent remarks regarding the Black Hawk helicopter crash. He suggested, rather definitively, that the aircraft was flying too high. That's quite a statement, considering the investigation is still underway." A murmur stirs through the room, a tactical shift. If they couldn't pin the administration on immigration, they would press on this. A comment, a sound bite, a moment to exploit. "Can you clarify what the president meant?" Continues, his pen tapping lightly against his notepad. "Was this based on concrete findings from investigators, or was this an assumption on his part?" A calculated question, framed as inquiry but laced with insinuation. The energy in the room shifts immediately. A few reporters lean forward, sensing an opportunity. This is how the game is played. If they can cast doubt on the president's words, they can control the narrative. Karoline exhales slowly, not out of hesitation but out of calculation. Then she meets Ree's gaze, unwavering. "Let me be absolutely clear," she begins, her voice steady, deliberate. She allows a measured pause, letting the weight of her response settle before she even delivers it. The president's comment was not speculation. It was not conjecture. It was a reflection of the briefings he has received from senior officials overseeing the investigation. Her gaze doesn't waver, locking onto Ree with the precision of someone who knows exactly what he's trying to do. This administration takes this incident with the utmost seriousness. The National Transportation Safety Board, the Department of Defense, and multiple agencies are working around the clock to determine the exact sequence of events that led to this tragedy. And the president, she pauses, her tone sharpening, he is ensuring that every detail is examined, every report scrutinized, and that no stone is left unturned. A shuffle of movement at the front of the room. Another journalist jumps in before Ree can follow up, this time, Emily Carter. "But Miss Leavitt," Carter interjects, flipping through her notes with deliberate slowness, "are you saying the president wasn't premature in his remarks? Because some aviation experts have suggested that statements like these, before a full report is released, could influence public perception before all the facts are known." A murmur spreads across the room, a tactical maneuver. If they couldn't catch her in one question, they would try again from another angle. Karoline doesn't flinch. Instead, she steps forward slightly, her presence commanding the space. I understand the media's impulse to seize on every syllable the president utters, she says, her voice now carrying an unmistakable edge. But let's set aside the speculation and focus on what actually matters. The room stills. Reporters, many of whom had been ready to fire back, pause. The president's comments were based on direct briefings. The investigators leading this inquiry are in communication with him, ensuring he remains fully informed. That's the reality. She glances around the room, holding the moment just long enough to make an impact. Then smoothly she shifts. But if we're going to talk about what's premature, she continues, perhaps the better question is this. Why is the media so quick to scrutinize a factual remark from the president, yet so hesitant to dig deeper into the details of the crash itself? A subtle but decisive reversal. The tension in the room shifts. The control of the narrative tilts back in her favor. Because at the end of the day, she presses, her voice unwavering, the real priority isn't sound bites. It's the truth. And in this administration, we're committed to delivering it. She straightens, her expression unreadable. Silence, a brief, charged pause. Rhee and Carter exchange glances, the gears turning behind their expressions. The press is recalibrating, searching for a new opening, a fresh angle. Then, Jonathan Rhee leans forward again, his voice measured but carrying an edge of quiet provocation. Miss Leavitt, let's talk about the internal dynamics of this administration. There are reports indicating significant disagreements within the White House regarding the handling of this investigation. Some sources claim that top officials are divided over what should be disclosed to the public. Can you confirm whether this administration is, in fact, unified, or is there discord behind closed doors? A loaded question, carefully designed not just to extract information but to introduce doubt. Emily Carter doesn't wait. She presses forward, layering on the pressure. In fact, she interjects smoothly, flipping through her notes, we've received conflicting statements from different officials. Some advocate for full disclosure, while others appear determined to control the narrative. That doesn't exactly project an image of stability, wouldn't you agree? A carefully coordinated offensive, not just a question but an attempt to force Karoline into a defensive posture. A flicker of movement spreads through the room. Pens hover above notepads. Lenses zoom in. The press is poised, waiting, anticipating a misstep, a hesitation, a single moment of uncertainty. But Karoline Leavitt doesn't hesitate. Instead, she tilts her head slightly, the faintest trace of a knowing expression flickering across her features. Let's cut through the noise, she says, her tone even, unhurried. She clasps her hands lightly, a deliberate show of confidence, not deflection, not evasion, but control. Speculation makes for compelling headlines, I'll give you that. But reality? It's a little less exciting. A pause, just long enough to let them lean in. This administration, from the president to his senior advisors, operates with complete alignment when it comes to transparency and accountability. Are there discussions? Absolutely. That's what leadership demands. A room full of yes men doesn't make for strong governance, it makes for reckless decision-making. She lets that sink in, then continues. But let's be clear, robust discussion is not dysfunction. The fact that this administration values debate does not mean there's division. The president expects his team to challenge assumptions, to pressure test solutions. That's how effective policies are crafted. And when it's time to act, we do so decisively. Rhee isn't satisfied. He leans in, his tone sharpening. So you're saying there's no discord because certain sources say otherwise? It's a classic move, demanding an absolute statement so that if any future discrepancy arises, they can claim a contradiction. But Karoline is already ahead of him. She exhales, not in exasperation but in something closer to bemusement. Let's be honest about how this works, she counters, her tone carrying just enough of an edge to slice through the pretense. Every administration has internal conversations, just like every newsroom debates which angle to push before a story goes to print. Just like every journalist in this room decides which details to emphasize and which ones to conveniently leave out. A shift in the energy. But let's not pretend that vague, anonymous sources, people who conveniently never seem to go on record, somehow carry more weight than the officials actually in the room leading this response. A measured pause, enough to let the challenge linger. Then, with surgical precision, she delivers the final blow. If you want to understand this administration's approach, listen to the people responsible for executing it, not to second-hand whispers crafted to fit a narrative. She lets the silence stretch just long enough. The press corps has spent the last half-hour probing, pushing, maneuvering. But Karoline Leavitt has batted down every attack, countering with a level of control that has left them scrambling to regain footing. But they aren't retreating, not yet. This isn't about getting answers anymore. This is about winning the exchange. And so, the strategy shifts. If they can't corner her on policy, they'll go after the bigger fight, the battle over the press itself. A journalist from one of the major networks, a seasoned player in these briefings, leans forward, eyes sharp, voice carefully measured. "Miss Leavitt," he begins, "let's discuss the media's role in this administration. The president and his allies frequently claim that the press is biased against him. But isn't it the job of journalists to scrutinize those in power? Are you suggesting that this administration should receive less oversight than previous ones?" A thinly veiled accusation, a trap, if one isn't careful. But Karoline is careful. Scrutiny, she lets the word hang in the air, her voice carrying the weight of pointed incredulity. Is that what we're calling it? A shift, small but significant. She leans forward, her gaze locking onto the reporter, steadfast, unwavering. Let's not insult anyone's intelligence here. No one in this room truly believes that the media is simply applying standard scrutiny to this administration. Her voice sharpens, a controlled blade, cutting through the carefully curated facade of neutrality. What we are witnessing isn't journalism. It's selective outrage, manufactured narratives, deliberate omissions. And frankly, the American people see right through it. A visible shift in the room. Some reporters shift in their seats. Others tighten their grips on their pens, sensing the direction this is headed. But Karoline isn't finished. "Tell me this," she continues, her tone taking on a calculated edge. "Where was this level of scrutiny when the last administration ignored a border crisis, allowed inflation to skyrocket, and projected weakness on the world stage? Where were the relentless front-page exposes? The primetime panel discussions dissecting their failures?" The silence stretches just long enough to let the question land. She doesn't expect an answer, because she knows there isn't one. Then she delivers the pivot. "And now," she presses, her voice unwavering, "when this administration follows the law, enforces policies that the majority of Americans actually support, suddenly it's controversial. Suddenly it's unprecedented. Convenient, isn't it?" A crackle of tension pulses through the room. Some reporters exchange quick glances. Others remain frozen, their pens hovering over notepads. But Karoline doesn't relent. "Let's be absolutely clear about one thing," she continues, her voice steady, unwavering. "The president isn't asking for a free pass. He isn't demanding praise. But he, and the American people, deserve fairness." A measured pause before she delivers the final blow. Not one set of rules for his administration and another for his predecessor. Not cherry-picked scandals while real crises are conveniently ignored. And certainly not a press corps that behaves less like independent journalists and more like political operatives. She straightens, her posture firm, her expression unshaken. "So let's drop the pretense," she says, her gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to challenge her. "If the media truly wants to regain the trust of the American people, maybe, just maybe, it should start by reporting the truth instead of crafting a storyline first, then searching for ways to justify it." The weight of her words presses down on the room, an unshakable force that reverses the usual power dynamic of these briefings. For once, she holds the room, not them. Some reporters shift uncomfortably. Others scribble furiously, as if desperately searching for a counterattack. But before anyone can speak, Karoline steps back slightly from the podium, her message clear, her ground unshaken. "At the end of the day," she says, her voice unwavering, "this administration isn't here to placate the press. We are here to serve the American people. And that means cutting through the noise, ignoring the political theater, and focusing on the issues that actually matter. She delivers the final strike, her voice unwavering. The president doesn't play word games. He doesn't dance around the truth to make it more palatable for the media. He says what millions of Americans are thinking, even if it makes the Washington press corps uncomfortable. A long silence follows. The usual rhythm of a press briefing, where journalists control the tempo, steering the narrative, has been decisively upended. She has seized control. Then, after letting the moment linger just long enough, she steps back, her posture signaling absolute finality. "If there's one thing we can all agree on," she says, her voice steady, "it's that transparency is a two-way street. The American people deserve a press that holds every administration to the same standard, that reports facts without political bias, and that doesn't selectively decide which stories deserve coverage based on partisan leanings." She pauses, then delivers the closing strike. And if there's anyone in this room who disagrees with that, perhaps it's not the White House that should be answering the tough questions. The press has pushed, pressed, prodded. Yet, each time, Karoline Leavitt has held the line, flipping their attacks back onto them with surgical precision. But they're not done. They can feel the briefing slipping from their grasp. The tempo is no longer theirs to dictate, the narrative no longer bending to their will. So, one last attempt, a final play. From the back of the room, Emily Carter makes her move. "Miss Leavitt," she begins, her voice steady but edged with something sharper, not skepticism, determination. "You've spent much of this briefing positioning the media as the aggressor, as though the press is acting in bad faith." She pauses deliberately, eyes flicking around the room, subtly reminding her colleagues that they are all stakeholders in this moment. But let's be clear, this administration has not been shy about using combative rhetoric against journalists. The president routinely dismisses critical coverage as fake news. His allies openly accuse the press of being the opposition party. She leans forward slightly, the pressure behind her words intensifying. "So tell me, Miss Leavitt, at what point does this administration acknowledge its own role in fostering hostility between the White House and the press corps? Because, from where I stand, it seems like the president isn't looking for fairness, he's looking for obedience." A low murmur spreads through the room. This is the question they were waiting for, the moment they've been building toward all along. Because this isn't just about policy anymore. It's about power, control. The press controls the narrative, and that's what they want Karoline to admit, that this administration isn't seeking accountability but submission. A blatant accusation wrapped in feigned neutrality. A final gamble. And yet, Karoline doesn't blink. She doesn't bristle. She doesn't stiffen. Instead, she smiles. Not amusement, not condescension, but a quiet, unwavering certainty. Then, she leans ever so slightly into the microphone, her voice calm, deliberate, but laced with something dangerously close to amusement. "That's quite a conclusion, Miss Carter," she muses, tilting her head slightly. "Interesting, though, how it seems to mirror the very thing you're accusing this administration of doing." The room stills, a beat. Then she leans back, exhaling lightly, as if almost humoring the question, though the sharpness in her gaze tells an entirely different story. "Let's talk about hostility," she says smoothly. "Because the last time I checked, this administration hasn't spent the last 4 years running cover for one party while vilifying another. This administration hasn't cherry-picked which stories to amplify based on political convenience. And it certainly hasn't buried scandals that, had they occurred under a different president, would have been front-page news for weeks." A noticeable tension ripples through the room. She doesn't stop. "You accuse the president of being combative," she continues. "But let's not pretend this hostility was created in a vacuum. The American people watched for years as the press abandoned its role as an objective institution and transformed into something else entirely, a machine designed to control perception rather than report reality." Another pause, the weight of undeniable truth settling into every corner of the briefing room. "And now," she presses, her voice crisp, unrelenting, "when this administration refuses to play along, refuses to accept the terms dictated by a media ecosystem that long ago chose sides, suddenly, that's considered dangerous. Unprecedented." She laughs softly, but there is no humor in it. "Let's call it what it is," she says, each word razor sharp. "This isn't about accountability. It never was. This is about control." And for the first time in years, the press no longer has it. A long, weighted silence grips the room, not the kind that follows victory, nor the kind that signals defeat, but the kind that comes when a power structure has shifted, and everyone knows it.